This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ICG's Digital Academy webinar series. I'm Sally Alsop, the ICG committee member responsible for running our webinar programme. So for today's webinar, we're delighted to welcome Rick Wilmot, Head of Sales and Marketing, and Scott Brooks, Cyber Security Expert, both at Cheeky Monkey. Based in St Albans, Hertfordshire, Cheeky Monkey has been providing managed IT support to businesses in London and throughout the UK since 1999. They deliver enterprise-level services and solutions with their team of experts acting as your personal IT department, rapidly and efficiently responding to issues, often before you even know they exist. They cover everything from servers and network infrastructure to computers, workstations, and mobile devices, providing end-to-end solutions for all their clients' technology needs. During this webinar, Rick and Scott will take us through how to be more cyber aware, the threat landscape, how small businesses are targeted, and what we can do to protect our businesses. If you've had any IT security horror stories and are willing to share what happened and what you learned from your experience, we'd love to hear from you during the webinar. Also, Rick and Scott are happy to take questions at the end, so please type your questions into the chat box as we go along, and I'll read them out at the end, or simply turn on your webcam and raise your hand if you would like to ask your questions yourself. So before I hand over to Rick and Scott, here is a reminder about the ICG's end of year online get together. Do join us with a glass of your favourite tipple. There are also some dates for your diary as we launch our exciting new programme of events and webinars in 2023. For more information and to sign up, do visit the events page on our website. And don't forget that we're able to offer great value sponsorship opportunities with each of our webinars. Sponsorship normally costs £120 for a lot of exposure on our website, mailers and social media, and of course on the day. And please contact Lucy if you'd like to know more. So our speakers today are Rick Wilmot and Scott Brooks of Cheeky Monkey, and I will now endeavour to hand over to Rick and Scott.
Thank you, Sally. Good morning, everybody. We're here to talk today around cybersecurity and focused on defence in depth and what you can do really to mitigate against risk for your organisation. So we prepared a presentation. Hope it's not going to be too arduous and boring, and hopefully you get one or two useful bits of information out of this as we go through the process today. So just to get started, did anyone have any horror stories that they're willing to share? We obviously through the ICG have picked up a couple of clients, and it's been based around some issues that they've experienced. So I know that some people may be reluctant to share, but I'm sure that Scott, you could probably give an example of some typical issues that clients have experienced on our side.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's mainly that we've seen through phishing attacks in the recent couple of years, really, and the attacks have gone up exponentially, and the sophistication of these attacks as well. So we've had and picked up clients basically saying that they've been attacked through different means, through phishing, whether it's the first communication through phishing, click on this link and downloading a particular piece of software which is malicious, and it's not being picked up by any anti-spam, antivirus or anti-malware, and them installing it on their machines, or just being like the person in the middle, interjecting into a conversation that's already going on between two people within the business, or an external person talking to an internal person. We've had that as well, where they've been tendering for contracts and interjecting themselves in the middle of those conversations. Bearing in mind they've already got a trust relationship there with some providers or individuals within the business, and they're asking for bank details to be changed in particular, or they're asking for other services, essentially, in terms of like a tendering process, for instance. So one particular one that I'd like to mention essentially is just, again, we've had a charity, and we picked up this charity because of this. Essentially, they got this attack, which was like an inline or a man in the middle attack in terms of security, and what we call that, where a trusted provider that they were using for the construction of a new office and some new space that they were being provided was asking for some payment of completion essentially, and this particular attacker interjected in a third party's email system and changed some banking details, and they asked for some payment now, and that payment went through, and it was about £150,000 basically. They got paid of this charity's money, and because they had this line of trust in place and none of spam or anything picked that up, essentially the finance department just paid that. So my takeaway from this, or your takeaway from this, should be that even though you've got some of these cybersecurity protections in place, your processes and procedures within your businesses are critical and vital as well to protecting you, not just some of this stuff that we're going to go through today. So yeah, that's one thing that let this business down, was their procedures in terms of how they were communicating to these third parties and not double checking some changes in banking details, and they just changed the banking details and paid this money almost blindly to them, even though they knew who they were. But they trusted this change essentially within the finance payment procedure, and just paid this £150,000 to this other unknown entity without checking.
So I think one of the big things we've noticed is a focus on trust, and as the slide that you can see shows there, a lot of businesses aren't willing to share their horror stories, and it's because of a fear of customers losing faith in them, and rightly so. I mean, if you look at some of the key stats here, 44% of UK consumers can claim that they would stop spending with a business temporarily after a security breach, whilst 41% claim they will never return. That could obviously have a massive impact on businesses. So cybersecurity is a key thing to get right from the outset, because once the damage is done, it can be hard to put right again and build that faith back from your customer base. Some of the key sectors that we see with what we do that continue to be main targets are anything finance related. Oil and gas and energy seems to be for the bigger markets, but even on the lower end, for smaller businesses and micro businesses, anything that's based around sort of legal and professional services, if you think about it, a hacker will typically want to get access to data or any kind of like financial value that you have within the organization. So if you're providing professional services or professional advice to a set of clients, then by hacking you, they've got access to your customer base. So whatever we can do to mitigate that is key. Threats are changing all the time. Scott and the team here at Cheeky Monkey, we always see many threats that are coming to market, and we do everything we can to help strengthen our offering to our existing customers. Long gone are the days where you could have antivirus in place and you'd be nice and secure. Hackers can easily bypass your basic sorts of security mechanisms that you've got in place. And obviously, by having an in-house cybersecurity team, that would be a great idea if everyone could afford it. But if you're a small business with maybe 1 or 2 users, then that's very cost prohibitive, and it's not going to be economically viable to you. And one of the key points here, and this is a big thing, is untrained employees can open the door to an attack. So it's all about having that security awareness across the business. So whatever you can do to help inform your users or your staff about potential threats is going to be key as your first line of protecting the business and the organisation. So I wanted to hand over to Scott now just to talk about some of the typical sort of cyber attacks that we've seen. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but this is a list of some of the examples of attacks that we see that are going on at the moment.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, so I'm going to go down the list and just briefly explain bits and pieces. I'm not going to go into too much technical detail around them, but I'll pick out a few that's quite relevant to today's world and what we see quite consistently. And I think the message before we go through each line item is essentially just make sure you've got those protections covering each one of these types of attacks, and basically to mitigate them, and also some technology as well that we and how we work is making sure you've got overlaying technologies, which is the defense in depth part. So having a firewall to protect you from an outsider perspective from an internet connection, and also your firewall turned on individual machines as well, can also assist with protecting devices at different layers from internal and external perspectives.
I think that kind of jumps into where, Jeff, your question here that you've raised about mitigation strategies. We will absolutely come on to that, and you're 100% correct that it's not a case of if an organisation is going to get a breach now or an attack, it's when, and it's about making sure that you've got the right protection in place to protect yourself against that. So thank you for raising that point, and I'm sure we'll cover that off on probably the next slide.
Yeah, absolutely. So malware attack, otherwise known as ransomware as well, we might have heard it as. So we've seen ransomware jump up from literally nothing in the last sort of 5 years, and ransomware is one of the main types of attacks now that we see, hence why we put it so high on this list. And essentially for an attacker, they want to encrypt all your data. So whereas a cybersecurity professional is using encryption to protect your data, an attacker is using encryption to do the opposite. They are protecting the data from you getting to that data and demanding a payment or some reward, essentially, to be able to get your data and return your data to you. Backups are one of the key things here. Having a good, decent, strong backup that you test regularly as well is one of the main concerns that we deal with day in, day out, and testing backups, making sure you've got a good disaster recovery plan, and how you, as a business, continue to operate in that period as well. So having good business continuity. But again, one of the main things is having a decent backup. But the backup, this is what we'd say to all of our clients, is the last point of call. You don't even want to get to your backup, because as soon as you get to that point where you have to recover, your business is down for a period of time because you are recovering. Now, whether you're recovering a whole server or lots of data or little bits of data, you're still down for a period of time, and you don't want to be down at all. So the backup is the last point of call, and the disaster recovery procedure should be the last point of call. Phishing attacks, again, massively on the rise, and they're, again, partly through user awareness and user training. People can spot fake emails, and I think we mentioned types of phishing attacks and whaling attacks and different types of spam, essentially, and how to protect yourself against them. The majority of the protections against these types of phishing attacks is having a good anti-spam mechanism, sort of wheedling out the obvious spam and the people that aren't very clever in their approach to attacking a business, and those people that have attacked a genuine account. So, for instance, if I send an email from Rick's account, Rick's got a genuine account, but it's just the contents of that email that is malicious or isn't genuine. So making sure you've got things in place to, like when you open a link, it detects what type of link it is, and if it's going to a malicious bad site, having things like DNS protection and mail filtering, and also sandboxing in there, which Microsoft provide all of that, and we provide all of that, which we'll come on to a bit later as well. Password attacks, using strong passwords, making sure you've got special characters in there. The standard nowadays is to have a password of 12 characters or more, using special characters, uppercase, lowercase, and numbers. And if a password is 8 or less, essentially an attacker will be able to crack that in less than 3 weeks. So the standard, if you're looking at anything like Cyber Essentials, should be 12 or more characters. and Cyber Essentials is sort of like the government's recommended lowest standard, essentially, that you should be looking at, and you can then build upon that. Build upon that and go forward with where your next milestone is in terms of your standard within your business. Man-in-the-middle attacks, sometimes known as on-path attacks, essentially interjecting yourself between two machines. So if you're talking to a website or you're talking to another provider, essentially, if I, as an attacker, interject into that communication in the middle, and I can see what's going on, I can again change some of the details about that email, or I can change the details about that website. I can gain access and know your password, for instance, if you type it into a website. So man-in-the-middle attacks are on the rise as well. Again, they come through phishing attempts and things like that mainly. But yeah, protecting yourself against those type of attacks is critical. Something that smaller businesses won't necessarily be too concerned with denial of service attacks, where an attacker essentially just tries to infiltrate by overwhelming a system, essentially, and bringing a system down to its knees because it can't handle that amount of traffic. And things like PayPal or banks are susceptible to this, and we've seen that happen in the past, where banks and things have actually gone down from a denial of service attack. Insider threats, now this is again one of the main ones, and an insider threat mainly is essentially from employees leaving or users clicking on things and doing malicious things within the organisation, or even stealing data. So monitoring that data and having things in place to mitigate theft of data or assets within the organisation, that's a real key thing as well for businesses to focus on. Zero-day exploits, hackers exploiting an unknown vulnerability. So a vulnerability that's not yet known to the vendor or the cybersecurity community. And before a patch gets released to be able to fix that problem, that's what's known as a zero-day exploit. And something that we don't commonly see now is cryptojacking, basically attacking a machine and using it to mine cryptocurrency. Things like Ethereum and Bitcoin. We don't currently see a lot of that, but it was quite common probably 6 or 7 years ago, but we don't see it as much now. So things to help avoid an attack: having strong passwords, making sure a strong password is 12 or more characters with, again, decent strength password in terms of using random words, letters, things like that. Don't think about it as a single word anymore. Think about it as a passphrase. So having using things like you might read out of a book, like telling a story or a sentence, essentially, and then changing some of the numbers and characters around in there to represent letters or words and things like that. Don't use pet names, people's names, things that can be targeted from social media. Again, that's quite a common one. And don't use basic passwords, things that haven't got uppercase, lowercase characters in there, and special characters. Updating operating systems and applications is vital. The amount of organisations that get attacked and breached because their operating systems aren't up to date, or their firewalls aren't up to date, or their applications have got a bug in it, which leads to a breach of their data. Make sure that all of those applications are done regularly. And the minimum standard essentially for Cyber Essentials is that you do these updates within 14 days of it being released. So we've got automation in place that allows us to do that as well. Network security tools. Again, make sure your firewall, again, it's part of the entry point to your system, having a decent firewall in place. Firewalls nowadays aren't just a list of access codes basically that say this is allowed to come in, this is not allowed to come in. There's intelligence built into these systems to be able to block things, whether it's a link, whether it's a phishing type of email on some of them, whether it's about intrusion detection, making sure that if someone gets within the system, it can detect or block that intrusion as well. So firewalls are more intelligent nowadays, and there's no excuse essentially for having a basic firewall in place that's provided by BT or just a cheaper firewall in place. Scrutinising emails, and this comes on to security awareness training as well, spotting emails and making sure that those emails are legitimate, they come from a legitimate source. Just because it says in the top bar that Rick Wilmot sent the email doesn't actually mean it's come from his email address or his business email address. Make sure that's come from a legitimate location, a sender that you know, and make sure you've got things in terms of our technology that we use within emails, which is a sender policy framework, which helps block emails, DMARC and DKIM, which helps sign emails as well to make sure that they're valid and coming from a valid sender. And essentially that will help your systems, your email systems, to block emails that aren't from legitimate senders and people that have just set up email addresses on the fly. And using secure VPNs and secure Wi-Fi, especially in coffee shops. Make sure if you're connecting to an open public Wi-Fi, make sure you've got a VPN that's in use. Man-in-the-middle attacks or on-path attacks essentially are renowned in coffee shops, that you're attacking or getting attacked from an unknown Wi-Fi access point, and having a secure encrypted VPN in place from your machine to a VPN service or your office. It makes sure that the end-to-end communication is encrypted, so that there's no chance of anybody interjecting into that communication. Staff security awareness training is a massive key one here. It's part of GDPR, it's part of Cyber Essentials and any other type of cyber security certification that you go for, and making sure all your users in the business are aware of how to spot a phishing attack, what malware looks like and how it behaves, how to spot impersonation attacks as well through emails, what a virus does, what a link looks like, or how to spot a malicious link, how to spot a malicious website, and making sure that your users are aware of the threats that are coming through the door, essentially, so that they can spot them. And essentially, they're the first responders, they're the first aiders, essentially, of your system. You want them to be trained in how to deliver a first aid type service on your systems.
Just on that note, I think that the minimum requirement is once a year, isn't it, for being able to be certified? Absolutely.
So yeah, GDPR states that you have to have some type of cyber awareness training to be compliant with GDPR. So if you have any GDPR audits and things like that, that will be picked up, essentially, cyber awareness training. When we deliver cyber awareness training, we deliver it once a month, and we have different facets of cyber awareness training. We've got a video-based awareness training where users will go on some basic courses, and they'll be quizzed to see if they've learned from it, and get prompted to go through the module again. They're about 5 to 10 minutes long. And we also send spoof phishing emails out to employees as well, where they essentially get tested, but they're always on the guard. It's not used to catch anybody out at all. It's just basically used as a measuring stick to make sure that the cyber security training is actually working for the organisation, and make sure if there's anything that we need to specifically target, we can do so by sending out these types of phishing attempts to people's mailboxes, and see what users click on them, essentially, and what more we need to do to protect the organisation. And again, multi-factor authentication, we've touched on that in strong passwords, but multi-factor authentication is key. Microsoft say if you're using Office 365, it prevents 99.9% of breaches that happen on their platform. And essentially, it's just a code, whether you've got an authentication app on your phone or a text message. It's well worth having multi-factor authentication everywhere, and that's just not email. That's across the board. So any cloud service or any application that you log into day to day, make sure you've got multi-factor authentication enabled. Coming back to backups again, backups come up quite a lot. Again, it's your last point of call. You need to make sure all of these things, if they fail, then you have a strong backup that you can rely on. And there's no good having a backup that you don't test, Because if you come to recovering from that backup and you can't get what you want from that backup, then what you're backing up is irrelevant anyway. So make sure you're testing your backups regularly and you're backing up the correct things and how long it takes to recover what you need from that backup. So if it's a full system, do a full system test, and then you know roughly how long it will take to recover the full system from if your systems were completely down and out.
Thank you. So some alarming numbers here. This talks about home working, but this is more an impact point for organisations that aren't all working together within an office environment. So it can apply to small businesses that maybe have 1 or 2 users that aren't working with each other all day, every day. But because people are siloed, they're more likely to just act in haste rather than picking up and questioning things. You can see here that in 2020, there was a ransomware attack every 14 seconds. For 2021, it's got quicker. We haven't got the stats yet for this year, but I'm expecting it to be even faster than that. And you can see on the right-hand side there, the sheer number of organisations that are being hit with ransomware attacks, how many are successful, and the typical value, including recovery, it's staggering. So it just leads on to this, that the real issue here is that cybercrime is on the rise. When Scott and I were talking earlier on today, he made me aware that cybercrime has overtaken drug-related revenue, and it's now the #1, I think, sort of like crime or criminal activity. And you can see here that the average downtime being for 16 days for an organisation. I mean, that could be, you know, really detrimental. It depends on the nature of the business that you're running, but being down for 16 days, that could be crippling. So by putting what you can in place to mitigate against the risk, it's going to prevent these sort of things from occurring. So, Scott, are small businesses a real risk? Are they a target?
Absolutely. I think when people think about cyber security, they're always thinking about these large corporate enterprises that are targeted and you hear about on the news. And you never hear about some of these smaller businesses that are targeted, but more often than not, it's these small businesses that are targeted and they're down for the 16 days like you were talking about, Rick, because they just don't have these protections in place. The larger organisations are aware they've got teams of people sitting there poking, prodding their environments every single day. They've got some of these technologies that we've been talking about in here, and they've had them for multiple years, and they've refined their policies, procedures and practices and how operationally they deal with any breach. But smaller businesses are a massive target. They're just easy pickings essentially for these hackers. And we're not talking about government-sponsored hackers or anything like that. We're talking like some of these call centres that you get abroad, that you might get on the phone that ask you, say, "Oh, we're calling from Microsoft. Can you give us access to your PC? Can you basically, we'll send you this link and click on this link to install this latest update for this piece of software," or it's something that might be quite relevant to what you're talking about, but you don't have any knowledge of someone being in your mailbox essentially. So it's really hard to defend against if you're not looking for these things. So small businesses are the main target. It's where the attackers get most of their revenue from. Essentially, if they attack one large business, then they might not even succeed, but they can send out a broadcast to all these smaller entities, these smaller businesses, and they've got a much higher chance of actually getting some revenue back from that than actually trying to target one larger organisation, which they might spend 6 months, 9 months, a year trying to infiltrate, and they might not even be able to do it because of the skills required to be able to do that. Whereas they can send out a broadcast to all of these smaller businesses, maybe 10, 50, 100 businesses, and all they need is one to fall for the attack, and that's it. They're away. And there's some scary stats. I know you've provided some already, but an attacker is in someone's system 6 months before they even get detected, before they actually start their activities, because they're farming all your data. They're looking at what they can get out of it. They're getting to know the types of communications you send within emails and things like that. So even before you know that they're in your environment, they're there for 6 months and scraping through all that data and conversation history, looking at what's happened prior, which is a really scary thought as well.
The other thing to add to that, I think, is the fact that with attacking smaller businesses, you're more likely to get an attack to a decision maker and a business owner, particularly with micro businesses. So if they're told they need to make a payment, they got straight to the person that holds the purse strings, and they're able to make the decision to pay for any sort of activity or being breached. Question I've seen on here from Sally: if you use cloud services such as Microsoft 365, do you still need additional backup? Absolutely. Microsoft offers a retention policy, but not a true backup built into 365. So, Scott, you might want to just give an example or just talk about that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So we use something called SaaS Protection to back up all users' mailboxes, their personal business OneDrive accounts, any SharePoint data, Teams data, and essentially there's some scary things out there that an attacker can send you a link. Basically, you can click on that link and it'll come up with your username and password, and it looks like it's the Microsoft login page. You can hand over your details basically to this attacker, and then they're in. Essentially, they're never going to log out again until you force them to log out, and then they can see your data. Now, there's also another type of link which gets sent, and it's a type of ransomware that's on the rise, that we've seen, that gives a user, an attacker, access to a user's mailbox just by sending a link and clicking yes. Instead of them actually having that username and password, they've basically given them access using a link, which basically gives them permissions to all your mailbox, all your data, and they can ransomware all that and encrypt the whole of your mailbox. I think we had maybe if we've got some time to afterwards, maybe send a few examples out to some to IG.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's certainly some videos online that we like to share as well, where an attacker sent a link out, and the users basically just didn't know what that was asking for. It was asking for permission, but they don't know what for, and they click on yes to it unknowingly, and essentially then their mailbox has been infiltrated, and then they've encrypted the whole of their mailbox. So the only way out of that is to go to your SaaS Protection backup, whether that's in Google Cloud, whether that's in Office 365, it doesn't make any difference, and recover all of those emails and historical emails, because you're not going to get them back. Essentially, everything that has been encrypted, and the only way back out of that is to remove that encryption or restore the account. And if you can't remove the encryption, then the only option you've got is to restore the account.
Question from Andrew. You mentioned Microsoft and 365 a lot, but how does Google stack up in terms of security?
Same thing, exactly the same as what we're talking about. Obviously, we focused on the Office 365 question there, but Google's exactly the same. They've got the same sort of technologies and mechanisms in place to allow people access to mailboxes and things like that through APIs, and that's the technical term for it. And essentially, that's what and how an attacker gets access to your system, is you're allowing them to integrate through an API, which is how an application would integrate to a user's mailbox to monitor incoming and outgoing emails. So if you're using things like Salesforce or any sort of third-party ERP system, that's how that integrates to a mail system. So they're basically doing that. They're asking for permission, and the user's clicking yes to it. So parts of Office 365, we can disable that for users, and it's on by default across the board. But again, Google's exactly the same. You have to go and disable this stuff that's enabled by default as well. So
would you say that regardless of whether you're a Google-based user or a Microsoft-based user, the threat landscape remains the same?
It's exactly the same. They're using the same technologies behind the scenes to be able to access mailboxes. So yeah, they're just more targeted to the type of business and the technology they may be using. But yeah, right. It's still the same risk.
While we're on questions, there's another one here from Liz. What about mobile phone security? It surprises me how much less security seems to be in place, e.g. around Outlook on a mobile phone versus on a PC, where it's less easy to switch between Outlook accounts. On my phone, they're all live once I'm logged in. What measures should we take to improve security on our mobile phones?
Absolutely, yeah. So mobile phones are one of the key things, and making sure, again, your user account is secure, so that identity or user account is locked down by having strong passwords, MFA enabled on there. There's also mobile device management, where if you're a business and you provide devices, then you can fully manage a device and you can lock it down to just the business, and you can control that data. But what happens if you don't provide your users, your employees, particular devices? There's also mobile device management that targets bring your own device or personal devices, where you segregate that data from your personal device and what sort of personal data on your personal device to the business data. So if an employee leaves, you can wipe things like the company data off that device, or if that device gets lost and the user hasn't checked in, essentially their mobile phone hasn't checked into the system between a certain amount of period of time, you can actually get that data to be erased securely on that device. Also, you can set standards on the password length and stuff like that, to make sure that even if a user brings in their personal device and they don't want to set a password on that device, you can say that they have to set a password on Outlook to be able to access their email and download their company email. If they don't, then they can't download their email. And if they change that and it doesn't meet the company policy, then it'll get wiped within a certain amount of time as well. So making sure that you've got things like that in place are critical. So especially if you lose devices and things like that. Majority of devices like iPhones and Android devices now are encrypted straight out of the box. So if someone's trying to break into a device, they won't be able to if you lose it. But having a strong password on your device is key, and not having like a 4 or 6 digit PIN where someone can probably guess that within a few hours, and plug it into a PC to try and break that as well. It is also critical.
Brilliant. Another question from Sally. But doesn't multi-factor authentication prevent access by a third party? I think this goes back to the question we were having before around the 365.
Correct. Yeah. So having multi-factor authentication doesn't prevent an API being able to integrate with your email system or anything like that, because you've given that permission to an explicit source. That multi-factor authentication is null and void. Essentially, they've got around that mechanism. So making sure you've got multi-factor authentication prevents against like password attacks, password spray dictionary attacks, and things like that, and people just generally trying to guess the password. And also you'll get a notification on your phone or a text message to say that someone's guessed the password, and if it wasn't you, then you know to go and change that password. But having like a permissions style attack through an API, they're bypassing that mechanism. The same thing if you're integrating this in your ERP system or Salesforce or anything like that. You can't have your ERP system break and stop working essentially because it needs multi-factor authentication every single day. So it bypasses that. It's more of a background systems integration than a user login functionality.
Okay, great. So, with all that doom and gloom, what does that mean around what we can do to mitigate this risk as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, all doom and gloom. This on the left-hand side is part of the NIST cybersecurity framework. NIST is an American Department of Defense agency that specialises in cybersecurity, protecting any sorts of forms of energy or nuclear, Department of Defense, government agencies, and also the public sector as well. And this is part of their cybersecurity framework. So prevent, detect, monitor, and recover is the last phase on that framework, essentially. So having those measures in place to prevent these types of attacks, making sure, again, users aware why they need strong passwords, going through some of the cyber awareness training for each user and individuals, having decent firewalls in place, having your antivirus in place, having things like endpoint detection and response in place, which is essentially antivirus on steroids. It prevents against those types of attacks where antivirus can no longer protect against. If you see in the top right-hand corner of this picture on the right, a security operations center, and that's something that Cheeky Monkey provide. Essentially having security guards on watch of what's happening on your system 24/7. So if something does crop up, and say it's in the middle of the night where you're asleep and your machine's turned on or a server's turned on, then our SOC basically protects those assets that you've got and will detect an infiltration or a type of attack, whether it be ransomware or whatever, and they block, mitigate, kill, and remediate it as well. And that, again, that prevent and detect as well. So having SIEM, EDR, so SIEM is security information and event monitoring. Having all your systems essentially log into a central storage and having artificial intelligence basically look at all of this, because you don't want humans looking at things like this because it's boring, mundane. They're going to miss certain things, and have computers basically analysing all of this log information that comes from your network. And basically you can stitch things together. So if one system sees that Rick's trying to send out loads of emails from his system, and then there's loads of data being copied as well from a different location on Rick's machine, we're starting to piece all this information together through this SIEM solution, and like a security engineer can basically look into that and resolve those problems. Before, Rick sent hundreds of gigabytes of data out of company assets, for instance. And again, monitoring all of this, making sure this is all monitored as well. And the last stage is, if all of this fails, is the recovery phase, making sure that you've got decent backups in place and that they're tested. Testing backups are vital, just because you don't know if you can recover from a backup. If you don't test your backups, how do you know you can recover from them? And that's something that we like to say to our clients, and making sure we take on so many new clients that haven't got any backup testing procedures in place to make sure that they can actually recover from these types of cyber breaches. Because also what happens is the attacker will go after the backups as well. If they can take the backup out, they can take the live system out as well. Then the organisation has to pay the ransom. Essentially, there's no way out for them. So making sure you've got offline copies of that backup, as well as backup stored in different locations, whether it's cloud, whether it's on premise, and an offline copy. So make sure that if in doubt, if they can infiltrate that live copy, then you've got an offline copy of a backup that you can recover to.
Great stuff. So I guess, without it being a bit too salesy, one of the things that you need to consider as an organisation is that multi-factored protection and mitigation of risk across your organisation. I've just put this on here because this is a snapshot of some of the offerings that we provide. We've got like a basic enhancement, and we've actually now got the advanced security options in place. Whoever you're working with or whatever you're looking at doing in terms of security, it's worth looking at putting a bundle in place so that not only have you got your antivirus in place, but you've got all of the the surrounding additional protection, such as your DNS protection, some content filtering, endpoint risk assessment, the backup, like Scott said, for when all goes wrong, as long as you can actually get it backed up. Assistance with a proper password policy, security awareness training, and also making sure that everything is patched and up to date. We can cover any of this off separately if any of you want to have a further discussion. Don't want to go into too much more detail other than that for today. But I guess it's really over to you guys. If you've got any questions for us, hopefully you've had one or two useful nuggets of information from us today. The floor is yours.
That was really interesting. Thank you very much for that. Just realistic. I mean, the vast majority of the businesses within the ICG would be 1 or 2 man bands, maybe 1 or 2 that are a little bit bigger than this, or you use a lot of freelancers. But you know, obviously, we're not going to be able to afford to take expensive security mitigations. But what's the basics that we really should have in place to protect our data and make sure that
It's a good question. I mean, the way that, I mean, I can't speak for what other organisations do. We've tried to package it up so that we can offer that kind of basic user protection, basic device protection, and then you can assess whether it's affordable against, you know, the opportunity cost for if you do have a breach occur. So nowadays we see that even the 1 or 2 user organizations, they'll look to put as much protection as they can around their environment for that very reason. Typically we would see that endpoint protection, antivirus is obviously, although as we covered off through the presentation, it's a real low level of protection. It's still something that you should be having in place. DNS protection to make sure that when your users are online, you know, they've got that sort of web content is filtered, having some proper email filtering, engaging in having multi-factor authentication in place. You know, if you've got Microsoft 365 services, then the MFA enablement is free. It's just something that you put in place to help protect against your 365 tenant in your environment. It's doing those sort of things. Wherever you can also have that security awareness training to educate your users, they're the first line of defense for your organization. If the users are more savvy about the threats that are out there, then less things are going to be coming through. So it helps to protect you there. I've just seen 1 or 2 questions coming in on here. So hopefully, Sally, that covers off your question about the 1 or 2 enterprise organization. Again, if you want specific sort of costs, we can cover that off separately. But that hopefully gives you a bit of a flavour for the kind of levels of protection you should be putting in place as a basic. Are there other things we must do and can do for ourselves as a micro business, e.g. making sure our OS is up to date? Absolutely. So Microsoft will tell you when you need to be updating your operating system. If you're working on like an Apple phone, it will say that you need to update your operating system. Whenever you get the opportunity to run updates, you should do that, because it's patches and security being deployed to your device, to your endpoint, to make sure the protection is in place. I don't know if you've got anything additional you wanted to add to that, Scott.
Yeah, just to echo what you said there, really, just making sure devices are up to date. The actual hardware that you use as well is key, and make sure that's supported, because if the hardware is not supported, so let's say you've got a Mac from 2007, that device won't be getting any updates any longer because it's old. Essentially, Apple do not support that device anymore. You won't be getting any operating system updates. It's a little bit different with Windows, but with Windows and the likes of Dell, HP, and all the major manufacturers out there, they get to a point where a piece of hardware will not be supported anymore, where you will not get the latest upgrades to that piece of hardware. So over time, you'll get more and more vulnerabilities within that hardware, which won't be patched if it's out of support. One key thing is like a firewall. So if you're a business and you've got a business location with a firewall in place, we see this quite common, where we're going to do an audit for a new company or just a separate audit of an organisation, and they'll have a firewall that they put in like 10 years ago, but they don't have any support with that, so they don't get any upgrades or anything with that. They don't get any of the more enhanced features with that, and essentially that firewall has just been sitting there since the day they've installed it, and they haven't done anything with it. So they've got 10 years worth of vulnerabilities where an attacker can get into that firewall or into their system behind the firewall, which they can attack. And the same applies to your machines and phones, everything day to day that you touch, whether it's in your personal life or in your business life. Then yeah, you need to be updating and upgrading these things to the latest firmware versions, keeping it up to date, because daily, hourly, all these updates are being released for products on your devices. So making sure you've got a good, strong procedure for that is key. And as I said before about Cyber Essentials, if you're going for something like Cyber Essentials, then within there it stipulates that you should have any updates to your phones or devices within 14 days of them being released. And that's something that we really strongly recommend, because majority of these attacks and types of attacks are through vulnerabilities, and by patching your systems, you're removing those holes within the environment as well.
Another question here from Liz. Great question. So AV software seems to run in cycles in terms of efficiency and bloatware. Which AV would you currently recommend?
So we currently use Webroot, and with Webroot we get other bolt-ons and products for that, like Rick was mentioning about our DNS filtering and things like that, and cyber awareness training. We do everything through Webroot, so our team are trained through Webroot. So essentially any antivirus that you go with, the big name ones, the Symantec, the Sophos, are all good antiviruses. Kaspersky, they're all good antiviruses. There is none that sort of stand out on top of each other, because they all look at the same types of infections. And if you go to a website called VirusTotal, essentially they compare all the antiviruses to each other and what types of viruses they would have blocked, what types of viruses they wouldn't have blocked, and you can look things up. And that's a site that we use quite often to see and compare other antiviruses to what we do. In terms of bloatware, some antiviruses are more resource hungry than others. Webroot is really, really lightweight compared to the likes of Kaspersky or AVG. But again, it depends on what you're trying to achieve out of it. We have other things that we bundle in with Webroot, and we also have EDR, which is the antivirus on steroids, which we use SentinelOne to achieve EDR, which is endpoint detection and response. And we put that on top of antivirus. So having a lightweight antivirus application is key. Again, putting security measurements and risk mitigation pieces of software on machines. Yes, you need to make sure your machine's powerful enough to take it and deliver your work. But again, that's part and parcel of making sure you've got the right machine, you've got the right spec of machine for whatever security that you're putting in place, essentially. Yeah, great.
Question from Tony about an online backup service. So I can field that one. We work with a couple of different providers. We've seen that Acronis do a really good online backup service for their 365 environment, and I believe that they offer a Google-based backup. Could be wrong on that. Additionally,
so did you say Acronis?
Acronis, Acronis. They're a big player in the backup world, and I think they basically provide backup and security around a lot of things. But in addition, we've also been a partner with a company called Datto for a number of years, and they have a product which is called SaaS Protection, which stands for Software as a Service. So 365 being a software as a service protection. Same
for Google Cloud as well. The backup.
Yeah, they for sure do definitely back up Google as well as 365. And with that, you can go to granular level restore. So even if you accidentally deleted an email, you can go back and retrieve it. If you had something a bit more malicious, like a ransomware attack to your 365 environment, then you can do a complete restore before the attack occurred. As Scott said, it's kind of like the last resort. You don't really want to be doing that. So hopefully you've mitigated the risk before it happens. And in the event that, you know, if you need to have any kind of information around litigation as well, it's good for that. So you'd be able to retrieve data in that regard from there.
What was the name of the second company that you mentioned?
Datto, DATTO.
DATTO.
Yeah. So a lot of these companies they may have a direct to a business to business offering. Most of them go through channel. So whether you're working with us or another provider, usually they'll have a reseller they'll direct you to purchase your licensing through.
Okay.
Any other questions at all?
I think while we're waiting, just to, if there is any other questions, something that was said earlier about anything that we would recommend, again, like antivirus and things, I think you covered off, and updating the firmware, software, hardware, and keeping it up to date, is making sure you've got encryption turned on in your laptops. Something that we see every single day, basically, is people having encryption turned off on their machines. Now that's something that comes with even the home editions of Windows 10. So sometimes with small businesses, we actually see that they would go out to PC World and buy a machine which comes with Windows 10 Home or Windows 11 Home. With those products, it used to be with Home Edition you can encrypt the data on your hard drive on that operating system, but now you can with Windows 10 and Windows 11. So even if you've got the lower levels of operating system, you can actually encrypt the devices.
How do you do that? Where do you look for that encryption function?
Essentially, it's in the control panel. If you just type in the search bar, if you've got Windows BitLocker encryption or on a Mac FileVault, you can basically encrypt the whole hard drive and make sure that data is safe. So even if you lose that machine and someone tries to take out the hard drive or whatever, then they can't do that. And encryption is vital as well for people trying to get into a machine. So there's ways around having a username and password on a Windows machine where you can put in a USB stick and basically change the password. And if you've got encryption in place, you can't actually deliver that function and get around the username password or reset the user's password on that device. So having encryption there is critical for that. Otherwise, you can just basically plug a USB stick in or a CD into the machine, reset the user's account password, and then to whatever you like, or even blank, and then get straight in, and you can see whatever that user had on their desktop or anything. It's just like you were accessing your machine. So having encryption is critical as well.
Does that require another level of password, or is it just automated? You know, if you're using
I won't go too much into the technical details of it, but essentially there's a hardware chip that sits on the board of your laptop or desktop, and it encrypts the hard drive using a set of keys. So if the hard drive was taken out of the laptop, you'd have to have the really long recovery password, which is 64 characters or 32 characters, depending on what you're encrypting it to. And if that machine gets parted with the hard drive, you'd need that long number. Or there's other mechanisms in terms of you can have another password or a PIN to access your drive. So you can actually lock the drive until you put in a PIN or another password to be able to access it. Storing those recovery keys that you get given when you turn encryption on, whether it's Mac or Windows or any other device, it is critical as well, because otherwise, if you haven't got the recovery keys, even the likes of police or anything like that will not be able to get into your drive to recover any data. So make sure you've got those recovery keys to be able to access that drive.
Okay, I think we're pretty much out of time there now. So thank you very much indeed, Rick and Scott, for your webinar today and answering all our questions. It's been really interesting and useful, and I'm sure there's lots that we can go back and start working on to try and make our businesses that more secure. Thanks again. Thanks to everybody for logging in today, and do come and join us for our next webinar, which will be now in the new year. So looking forward to seeing you again then. Happy Christmas, everyone, and yeah, Happy New Year.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.